We're ready for English colonization part 12. This should finish it up, I hope. Um, we left off hanging Mary Dyer. I wanted to point out that was that was in the mid 1660s that happened, and as an illustration of how stories grow in the telling, a problem historians always have to deal with, lest they participate themselves. Um, it's hard to say blown out of proportion, but I was up there one time. I made one visit to Boston with my wife. This was in like 2011, and we took a walking tour of the part of the city where the original city had stood. And there was this woman who was the tour guide and all that, and I gave her about a B plus because I think maybe we passed the statue of Mary Dyer, and this woman seemed to have the idea that the Massachusetts Puritans were just hanging Quakers by the cartload, when in fact it happened one time. That's too many, but it was just one time. Okay. I want to finish this up now. I want to do a quick run through of the 13 colonies in more or less chronological order. And I suggest you get your regular textbook, the one that looks like this, and open it to page 113 and check the map on page 113. So that's what I'll be referring to as we go along. Of course, not all the colonies started out as English colonies, but we'll take it from there. The first one, of course, is Virginia, beginning in 1607. All 12 of the 13 would be established in the 1600s, over a period of actually just 75 years. The next one on the timeline, the next one to be established was not an English colony when it was first set up. It was called New Netherland. And it's basically what later became New York. It was established by the Dutch in about the year 1624. According to legend, they came in and paid the Indians approximately $24 worth of beads and trinkets for the rights to Manhattan Island, and established a settlement there called New Netherland. They had a very liberal sort of land policy. It was called the patroon system, where anyone who had the money to do this could qualify for a land grant of 16 miles of Hudson River frontage, with no limit on how far into the interior you would push it. Only a very small number of Dutch families achieved that, but it's such a key location economically that it attracted a very varied, diverse, polyglot population. And the 1740s, I think it was, someone reported hearing 16 different languages spoken in the streets of that town. Okay. In the mid-century, England and the Netherlands fought 3 different wars over trade. We don't need to get into those, but in the second of those wars, the younger brother of King Charles II happened to be James, the Duke of York, and the king told him if he could take over that Dutch colony, he could just have it. That sounds like a heck of a deal. So James sent a fleet over to New Amsterdam, which is the name of the town, and they were greeted as liberators by the population, and the Dutch governor had no choice but to just surrender on the spot without a shot being fired. So having taken over, he renamed the colony and the town after his own title, New York. It included, for the time being, what is now New Jersey. And he turned around and granted that to some of his friends. Where it got the name New Jersey, I'm not completely sure, but it was divided for a while into East Jersey and West Jersey, becoming just New Jersey shortly after the turn of the 18th century. Okay, so then the next English colony is Massachusetts. We just told you about that. Make sure you know where Massachusetts is up there. And there were a number of spin-offs. As I've told you, Rhode Island and Connecticut were both. Connecticut was, there were settlements at New Haven and whatever the other main town is. And these were people who were leaving Massachusetts for various reasons. One group thought that the Massachusetts Puritans were too strict and severe. The other group thought they were too lax and loose and liberal. So, anyway, Connecticut got a charter from King Charles II the same time that Rhode Island did, 1662. New Hampshire is a bit of a different story. There had been lawsuits going on ever since practically the whole century, as the original stockholders of the failed Plymouth Company and their heirs and on down were suing to try to get title to land. Some of them in 1679 sold out to the Massachusetts Bay Company, whereupon it acquired what much later became the state of Maine. But the court settlement in, I think, 1680 gave some of these remaining claimants a claim on what they named New Hampshire, and then they set about trying to collect rents from the people who'd settled there, as in, good luck with that. Back to Connecticut and Rhode Island for a second. Those two colonies would remain charter colonies in that throughout their time as colonies, they had the authority to elect their own governors. Okay. The middle 20 years of the 17th century, the political turbulence in England reached a peak. Parliament and the King Charles I, were at an impasse, and the King in 1642 basically declared war on Parliament. And you have a civil war, which defies all analysis. It doesn't divide cleanly along geographic lines, or social class lines, or religious lines. Make a long story short, the King lost, rather inconveniently for him, and sparing further gory details, he ended up getting his head chopped off. That was after he escaped from house arrest and attempted to raise troops to continue the war and got captured again. He was convicted of treason and was beheaded in January 1649. That makes him the last English monarch to have died by violence. Whereupon, with the Puritans completely in charge, they abolished the monarchy. They would reestablish it in 1660, but there's an 11-year period called the interregnum, period between the reigns. At first, they tried to have a kind of republic where they had a series of parliaments that never really had public acceptance because they had not been summoned by an anointed king. So the leading figure was a parliamentary army general named Oliver Cromwell, who simply took over in 1653 and ruled as king in name only, taking upon himself the title Lord Protector. He died in 1658. His mild-mannered son attempted to replace him, but quit after about 6 months. So, for the time being, there is no central government in England. To solve that, a former parliamentary army general brought an army from Scotland down to London. I'm simplifying grotesquely here. Rounded up all the survivors he could find of the last duly summoned parliament from 1640, stuck them in a room and said, basically, now boys, this is how it's going to be. And they invited the son of the late King Charles I to return from exile in France and to mount the throne as King Charles II. He accepted this. His arrival is known as the Restoration, with the capital R. Starts a party that lasted pretty much the rest of the century because the Puritans, while they were in power, were attempting to enact and enforce very rigid, very minute, detailed rules of personal behavior. That never works. So the remainder of the colonies were set up after that. Charles II was a friendly, affable, unassuming kind of guy because he kind of knew what kind of trouble his father got into. But secretly he was plotting. In 1670, he made a secret treaty with the King of France, where the King of France would subsidize him, giving him enough money to keep him somewhat independent of Parliament. In exchange for one of these days, he would spring the trap, and England would be a Catholic country once again. Charles II accepted Roman Catholic baptism on his deathbed. Okay. In 1670, He granted 8 of his friends an immense tract of land, really not very well defined, south of Virginia. So if you look on your map there, you see North Carolina and South Carolina. They were one for the first quarter of a century or so. The term Carolina comes from Carolus, which is the Latin form of the name Charles. One of them had a personal secretary named John Locke, that name ought to ring a bell, who devised a kind of prescribed social hierarchy system that never took root at all. It wasn't until the 1690s that Carolina was divided into North and South. In 1685, or the 1682, I believe it was, King Charles II granted a huge tract of land west of New Jersey to his boyhood buddy, William Penn. Now, William Penn was the son of an older William Penn, who was an admiral in the English Navy. William Penn the Younger had become a Quaker, very much outside the profile of that, because Quakers tended to be generally underclass people. This guy was buds with the king, and the king, the younger William Penn inherited from his father a huge IOU. The king owed him roughly 16,000 pounds. That's more money than the king could lay hands on. So the king settled it with a land grant, and over Penn's objections named it Pennsylvania, Greek for Penn's Woods. So Penn came over, went through a ceremony buying the land from the Indians, not overly troubled with legal niceties, and selected and laid out the site of his main town, which he named Philadelphia, which means City of Brotherly Love. I've been to Philadelphia exactly one time, but I did not observe brotherly love running in the streets of that particular place. But this city was a wonder of the world. Visitors to Philadelphia would just wander around bug-eyed and slack-jawed. They'd never seen anything like that. It had straight streets, intersecting at 90-degree angles, rectangular blocks, parks every now and then. It was laid out in a geometric pattern, the first city to be laid out in a geometric pattern since the Roman army stopped building towns in about the 3rd century. European cities had narrow, twisty angles, streets, buildings here, buildings there. No rational plan about it. That was for a grim purpose. They knew that their cities in Europe might have to be defended in house-to-house fighting, and straight streets is exactly the wrong thing you want for that. Okay, Penn set up his colony as a haven for English Quakers, and many came there, along with religious refugees from continental Europe. You see, in the first part of the century, religious freedom was not, it was extremely controversial. I left out a colony. I have to go back and pick it up. By the latter part of the century, it had become part of a standard package. If you're establishing a late arriving colony, you're competing to attract settlers with more established colonies. You gotta put something on the table here. So there are 3 things: free land, representative assembly, and religious liberty. So they have that. So you get a lot of Germans. I mentioned those under the terms of religious refugees earlier in the unit. Their descendants, who remain today, are simply called the Amish. Okay, the one I left out was Maryland. That's actually the 3rd one, 3rd English colony. It's north of the Potomac River. King Charles I granted it to a man named Cecilius Calvert, who held the title Lord of Baltimore. It happened to be a Catholic, so Charles was friendly to that, and helped him establish this colony as a haven for Catholics. However, very few came. It was mainly Protestants. To protect the Catholic minority, in the late 1640s, he had the Maryland Assembly enact the Act for Religious Toleration, making it the first officially constituted authority to have that right. Finally, we have Georgia. South of South Carolina, it was mainly meant as a buffer state. It drags in 50 more years after Pennsylvania. The early 1730s, named for King George II. Read about that in the supplement. It was, for a long time, the most isolated and sparsely populated of the colonies.